In the 1840s, issues like the Bank of the United States, the tariff, these issues kind of faded into the background, and Americans really became fascinated with the idea of territorial expansion, expansion out west. Americans were united in their belief that America's manifest destiny was to grow and expand within the Western Hemisphere. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine had established that the Western Hemisphere was all within the sphere of influence. It was in America's backyard. Now, what was this idea of manifest destiny? Manifest destiny was this idea that it was God's will, it was God's providence or destiny, that America grow and expand, and that this destiny was manifest. It was clear to all, and that America was going to continue to grow from sea to sea, from Atlantic to the Pacific. And Americans believed that America's destiny was due to the fact that America was a nation of good, strong Christian virtues. It was a nation that valued democracy and democratic principles. And Americans also believed that America's Anglo-Saxon heritage, its Anglo-Saxon civilization, made it a unique and superior country. In the 1840s, this shared faith in this idea of manifest destiny, it covered up the fact that there were simmering differences. There was differences between the North and the South, between the free states and the slave states, and this doctrine covered over that resentment and created among Americans a sense of unity. Now, unfortunately, this belief would also lead to a war with Mexico in 1846 over expansion and the acquisition of new territory out west. So what we're going to do in this lesson is, first of all, we're going to examine manifest destiny. We're going to look at the relationship between manifest destiny, this belief, and the outbreak of the Mexican War, and we're also going to examine the outcome of the Mexican War. So first of all, let's talk about the events leading out to the Mexican War in 1846. In 1841, William Henry Harrison, remember he had won the election in 1840, he died unexpectedly. He'd only been president for a very brief period, and as a result, his vice president, John Tyler of Virginia, would serve out the rest of Harrison's term. Now, Tyler was a Whig, but he was a slave owner from Virginia, and he had joined the Whig Party primarily because he had the same views and outlook as John C. Calhoun. In other words, he was a Whig, but he was not on board with Henry Clay's ideas of the American system. Now, in 1841 and 1842, the Whigs, who at the time had a majority in Congress, under Clay's leadership, he happened to be the Speaker of the House at the time, they passed a series of bills that were designed to put into effect Clay's idea of an American system. So in rapid progression, Congress passed a Third Bank of the United States. It passed an internal improvements bill, which would have used federal land sales to provide funding for canals and roads, and it also put together a higher protective tariff. This was all part of Clay's American system. Now, Tyler, who believed in states' rights, like his buddy Calhoun, he vetoed all of these measures. And the Whigs did not have enough seats in Congress to override the presidential veto. In other words, Taylor was going against much of his own party. All the Whigs could get out of this was a slightly higher tariff in 1842. Now, as a response to Tyler's vetoes, his Whig cabinet was shocked, and the entire cabinet resigned. The only member of the cabinet to stay in was Daniel Webster. The only reason he remained in the cabinet is because he was involved in delegate negotiations with Great Britain. Eventually, Great Britain and the United States would sign the Webster-Ashburton Treaty in 1843. This treaty was designed to put to rest a number of issues between Great Britain and the United States. There was the issue of the border between Maine and Canada, but there was also some issues. There was some accusations that Americans had been behind a rebellion in Canada in 1838, and also the fact that the British were seizing ships that they suspected of illegal slave trade. So this Webster-Ashburton Treaty was important in resolving some simmering differences between Great Britain and the United States. But as soon as the treaty had been signed and ratified, Webster resigned as well. So basically, Tyler was a president without a party. And so given the situation, he turned to his good friend and colleague, John C. Calhoun. And Calhoun would eventually, by 1844, become the Secretary of State. Now, Calhoun and Tyler, they didn't care about Clay's ideas of American system, but they believed was that the United States needed to expand. It needed to expand out west. And there were a number of areas where they saw room for America to grow. One was in Texas, very important Texas. Another one was the Oregon Territory, and another area was California. Now, Tyler and his advisor Calhoun believed that expansion into these territories was very important because it would unite the country under the concept of manifest destiny. And for Tyler and Calhoun in particular, it was important to add these territories, especially Texas, because they wanted to add new slave states to the Union to counter the fact that free states were gaining in number. They wanted to have a balance between the slave states and the free states. So these areas were Oregon, California, and Texas. So how did Americans get involved in these three areas? Let's begin with Oregon. The Oregon Territory, Americans really began to settle in the Oregon Territory beginning around 1841. That's when the first wagon trains began to rumble. They started in Missouri, and they'd travel along what was called the Oregon Trail, and they would cross the northern plains, across the Rockies, and then they would finally settle in the Columbia River Valley in what is today the state of Oregon. And remember, Americans believed that the plains were the great American desert, but they heard reports that Oregon was a rich country with trees and forests, and that's what attracted thousands of Americans into the region going by way of the Oregon Trail, by wagon train. And by 1845, you had about 5,000 Americans who had settled in Oregon. But the problem was that Oregon and Great Britain were jointly occupied by the United States and Great Britain. So there was an issue of where exactly the border would lie between the United States and Canada. Now, another area that was settled by Americans in increasing numbers, along with Oregon, was California. What would happen is that there developed a trail that branched off the Oregon Trail and went from the Oregon Trail into the Sacramento River Valley of Northern California. Now this area belonged to the government of Mexico. Now, this area was very sparsely settled by Mexican nationals. So the Mexican government was anxious for people to settle there. And in fact, in 1843, they had authorized a Swiss man by the name of John Sutter to come in and bring a group of Swiss settlers and to establish a colony. And he established the colony in the Sacramento River Valley, and he called it New Helvetia. It was also just called Sutter's Fort. But this settlement actually was a magnet, and it brought more and more Americans into Northern California. In fact, by 1845, there were actually more Americans living in California than there were Mexican nationals because of this immigration of Americans into the region. Now, by far, the area that most attracted Americans was Texas. Now, Texas had actually been first settled by Americans beginning in the 1820s and the 1830s. East Texas has a climate very similar to Louisiana. And so you can grow cotton there, and you can also even grow sugar cane. And so beginning in the 1820s and 1830s, Americans came in large numbers and settled in East Texas, and they brought their slaves with them. Now, they were allowed to enter this territory by Mexico, which had gained its independence only in 1821, if they agreed to convert to Roman Catholicism and didn't bring slaves. I mean, slavery had been abolished in Mexico back in 1821 when it gained its independence. But thousands of these Americans who came in and settled in Texas, they didn't convert to Catholicism, and they brought their slaves with them. In fact, by 1835, there were some 30,000 Americans living in East Texas, and they outnumbered the Tejanos. The Tejanos were the Mexican nationals, the Spanish-speaking Texans who had been there since basically the 18th century. So you had a large number, thousands of Americans living in what was the territory of Mexico. Now, for these Americans, for a lot of years, Americans were happy under Mexican rule. Mexico had written a constitution in 1824 where it was a federal constitution like the United States had a federal constitution. So the inhabitants of Texas were a state within the Federal Union of Mexico, and they had a large degree of self-government. And the Texans were happy with the situation. But that all changed in 1834. In 1834, Antonio López de Santa Anna was elected president of Mexico. Now, Santa Anna was very ambitious. He had plans of being a great military conqueror. He even self-styled himself the Napoleon of the West. Now, what he did once he was president of Mexico, he pushed through big dramatic changes in the Constitution. And basically, the old 1824 Constitution was scrapped, and it was replaced with a system that was much more centralized. In other words, instead of Texas having self-government, it was now going to have a governor appointed by Mexico City. And the president of Mexico had a lot of executive power. Now, the people in Texas were not at all happy with this situation because they basically lost self-government. And so this was what started what is called the Texan Revolution. In 1835, the Texans went ahead. They met in what is today Austin, Texas, and they organized their own government in defiance of Santa Anna and the Mexican government. Well, Santa Anna was not going to allow this Texas to succeed and leave the Mexican government. So in 1836, Santa Anna personally led an army of about 5,000 troops, and they marched north into Texas. Now, the Texans had massed at a place called the Alamo. There was a former mission that had been converted into a fortress in San Antonio, in South Texas. And there was a battle fought, and in the end, the Mexican troops were able to capture the Alamo, and they massacred the entire population, including Davy Crockett, who was fighting alongside the Texan revolutionaries. And now this action by the Mexican government, all it did was to fire up the Texans because they were outraged that so many of their compatriots had been slaughtered by the Mexican army. And the phrase, "Remember the Alamo," became the rallying cry, became the fighting cry of Texas in what happened next. So in 1836, the Texans had put together a sizable army, and the commander of the army appointed by the government of Texas was a man by the name of Sam Houston. He was a veteran of the War of 1812. He had been a governor of Tennessee. He was a friend of Andrew Jackson. And Sam Houston commanded the Texans' forces. Now, Santa Anna was caught off guard. His army was caught by surprise, and at the Battle of San Jacinto in 1836, the Mexican army was defeated by the Texan army, and Santa Anna himself was captured. Now, Santa Anna was told that he would be released if he formally recognized the independence of the new Republic of Texas. Now, Santa Anna wanted to go home, so he agreed to recognize the independence of Texas, and then he was released. Now, when he got back to Mexico City, the Mexican Congress was outraged, and they refused to ratify any treaty or recognize the independence of Texas. So Texas was an independent republic, but it was not recognized formally by the Mexican government as being independent. Now, so from 1836 till 1845, basically Texas was an independent country. Now Texas wanted to join the Union. One of the first things they did, the new Texas Republic, was to ask to join the United States as a state in the federal union. But the problem is that Americans were bitterly divided on the issue of whether or not to annex Texas. Southerners, for the most part, supported annexation because Texas was a slave area, and adding Texas would add a new slave state to the Union. Northerners weren't so sure. A lot of Northerners believed that any annexation of Texas would lead to war with Mexico, and a war with Mexico was just not what they wanted. They were not willing to add a new slave state to the Union so they could have a war with Mexico. Now, Andrew Jackson, when he was president, had been a big, strong supporter of annexation, but John Quincy Adams, the former president, he was now a congressman from Massachusetts. As early as 1838, he denounced any effort to annex Texas. He declared that that the whole business was a plot by slave power, that powerful, wealthier plantation owners had engineered the whole thing to add a new slave state to the Union, and he was bitterly opposed to adding Texas to the Union. So you had this division among Americans. Now, when Tyler was president, as a Southerner, as from Virginia and a slave owner, of course, he was all for the annexation of Texas. But he knew that that wasn't something that Americans were united on. So he emphasized this idea of annexation as part of a greater effort to expand American territory. So it wasn't just about Texas, but it was about California, it was about Oregon, and he believed that even if war was the result, then so be it. That if America expanded and that meant war with possibly Great Britain or Mexico, so be it. But despite all of his efforts, Tyler was not able to get Congress to get enough votes in Congress to agree to the annexation of Texas. So now in 1844, it was a presidential year, and the results of the election of 1844 would lead directly to the war with Mexico. You see, in 1844, the annexation of Texas would become the central issue of the presidential campaign. Now, in 1844, Martin Van Buren was thought to be the front runner. You know, he was the former president. But in the convention, the Democrats dumped Van Buren, and they instead went with James K. Polk of Tennessee. James K. Polk was a good friend of Andrew Jackson. In fact, one of the last things Andrew Jackson did before he died was to endorse Polk as the Democratic candidate for president. Now, Polk's campaign was all about westward expansion, about this idea of manifest destiny. And he pledged that as president, he would add Texas to the Union, he would add California, he would get Oregon, and whatever happened, if war happened, so be it. Now, the Whig Party, they went with the good old Henry Clay, the guy, this was his third time to try to win the presidency. Now, the problem that Henry Clay faced was that his party was bitterly divided over Texas. Northern Whigs, who many of them were Protestant evangelical Christians, they were opposed to the annexation of Texas because they knew that it would lead to war with Mexico, and they were opposed to slavery. Southern Whigs generally supported the annexation of Texas. Now, Clay was from Kentucky. He was a Southerner, and so in the midst of the campaign, he came out in favor of annexation. Now, by doing so, many historians believe that by supporting the annexation of Texas in his campaign, he lost a lot of votes. So people who normally would have, Whigs up north, who normally would have cast their votes for the Whig candidate, Henry Clay, instead they either didn't vote or they voted for a man by the name of James Birney. James Birney was running for president for a very small party called the Liberty Party. It was a party it was a one-issue party that advocated the immediate abolition of slavery. Now, this Liberty Party didn't win, it won very, very few votes, didn't win any states, but what happened is that Northern Whigs, instead of voting for Clay, they either didn't vote or they cast their vote for the Liberty Party. So even though the Liberty Party only got about 3% of the vote, they cost votes for Clay. And in the end, that was enough to give Polk the slight edge. It was a very close election. Polk only won the popular vote by 1%. So it was a very close election, and Polk won. So Polk won the presidency in a very close election, and since his whole campaign had been about the annexation of Texas, his victory was seen as a mandate from the voters, that the American people had spoken. So early in 1845, in March of 1845, Congress voted to formally annex Texas to the Union. And that was one of the last things that Tyler did before he left office. Now, as soon as the United States added Texas to the Union, Mexico immediately broke off all diplomatic relations with the United States. So already by 1845, when Polk assumed the presidency and was inaugurated, he faced a situation where we were on rocky ground with Mexico. Now, Polk got elected on campaign promises. He was all about territorial expansion. So he carried out what he said he was going to do. In 1845, he sent diplomats to Great Britain and to Mexico. Now, he had some really good success with Great Britain. There had been a lot of talk about war. There had been a lot of saber rattling. There had been talk about how America was going to demand all of the Oregon Territory. A 54-40 or fight was one of the catch calls, one of the rallying cries. But when it came down to it, after a year of negotiation, by about June of 1846, the United States and Great Britain basically came to a compromise. What they did was they split the Oregon Territory in two, and they used the 49th parallel, the line of the Convention of 1818. They just extended it all the way to the Pacific. So the area north became Canada, the area south of that line became the Oregon Territory belonging to the United States. So through diplomatic efforts, we did not fight a war with Great Britain, and the issue of Oregon was settled. Now, Polk also in 1845 sent diplomats to Mexico to try to work out a deal. Now, he put money on the table. He said, look, we'll send you $25 million, and all we want is California, New Mexico, and Mexico's formal recognition of Texas being part of the United States. But the Mexican government refused to give up any territory. They refused to even recognize the annexation of Texas. So basically, diplomatic negotiations with Mexico went nowhere. Now, Polk sent troops to protect Texas. He sent federal troops in the spring of 1846. He sent troops to Texas, and this led immediately to conflict. Some people, critics of the war, referred to the Mexican War as Mr. Polk's War because they accused him of starting the war because he sent troops into a region where there was disputed territory. You see, the Mexican government did not recognize the Rio Grande as the border between Mexico and Texas. They believed that the border was further north. So when the U.S. troops arrived just on the Rio Grande, there were Mexican troops already there because the Mexicans believed that territory was there. Well, what happened, there was a skirmish, and a number of Americans were killed. And when this happened on May 9th, 1846, when the skirmish occurred, Polk could say, look, Americans have been killed on American soil. Mexico has invaded America. It's time to take action. So he went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war. And it was a very close vote, but there were enough votes in Congress from southern and midwestern states to give Polk what he wanted. And the United States formally declared war on Mexico in 1846. Now, when this war broke out, it was not a David versus Goliath type battle. In fact, European observers were under the impression that Mexico could maybe even win this war. On paper, Mexico had a larger army than the United States. The United States didn't have much of a standing army whatsoever. Also, Mexico had a strong ally. Great Britain was not a military ally of Mexico, but Great Britain was financing the Mexican government. Great Britain had a lot of money invested in Latin America in general. And so the Mexican army had more money and was larger. But what the situation for Mexico was that the army, at this particular time, the Mexican army suffered from very poor morale, primarily because of very poor leadership. Santa Anna had been brought back to command the Mexican forces in the war, and he is generally regarded as the worst general in world history. Seriously, he was terrible. Now, while the Mexican government had one of the worst generals, the Napoleon of the West, one of the worst generals in world history, the United States was actually, it benefited from the fact that it had some of the best generals in its history, men like Winfield Scott and Zachary Taylor. Winfield Scott was called Old Fuss and Feathers by his troops, and Zachary Taylor was called Old Rough and Ready. Now, both men were veterans of the War of 1812. They had fought in Indian wars. They had a lot of experience, battle experience, and they were excellent military commanders. Also, American troops were very enthusiastic. Now, this war was very unpopular up in New England, but in the Midwest, like in Ohio and Indiana, and in the South, there was strong support for the war. People were excited about expansion and growth and the idea of manifest destiny, you know, America being this great Anglo-Saxon, Christian, democratic nation. And this is the great story. When the war began, he asked for 50,000 Americans to sign up to fight for their state militias. And 50,000 volunteers came from the state of Tennessee alone. That's why they're called the Tennessee Volunteers. So Tennessee alone provided 50,000 volunteers. Now, in this war, the United States had a great success. Just to give you an example, forces under the command of General Taylor marched into northern Mexico, and they met the army of Santa Anna at the Battle of Buena Vista. And now at this Battle of Buena Vista, Santa Anna had a 4-to-1 advantage. He had an army of 20,000 Mexicans as opposed to just about 5,000 U.S. troops. But in this battle, the Americans won the day. Jefferson Davis became a great war hero, leading a charge that won the Battle of Buena Vista in that campaign. Now, later in 1847, the United States shifted its strategy. Instead of trying to invade Mexico by land, by going through northern Mexico, instead they sent United States Marines and militia troops, and they landed at Veracruz along Mexico's Gulf Coast. And then Winfield Scott commanded an army that marched from Veracruz inland through the mountains against Mexico City. It was an immense achievement because basically he was outnumbered by the Mexican army. And at one point, he had to send half his army home because they'd only signed up to fight as militiamen for only a certain amount of time. But he carried the day, and in September of 1847, U.S. forces led by the United States Marines, they stormed Mexico City and took the city. So by September of 1847, Mexico City had fallen, and that resulted in the collapse of the Mexican government. At the same time, a man by the name of John C. Fremont led American forces into California, and another army commanded by Stephen Kearny marched from Missouri into New Mexico and captured Santa Fe. So all that territory, New Mexico and California, had been occupied by U.S. forces by the end of 1847. Now, the capture of Mexico City in 1847 basically ended military hostilities. But it wasn't until the following spring, or February actually, that the two sides met at Guadalupe Hidalgo, just outside of Mexico City. The two sides sat down to negotiate a treaty. By the end of February, the treaty had been signed, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Now, the Mexican government, according to this treaty, agreed to accept the annexation of Texas. They agreed to accept the Rio Grande as the border between the United States and Mexico and Texas. And they also agreed to hand over the territories of California and New Mexico in return for $15 million. Now, when this treaty was announced, the man who had negotiated the treaty was a man by the name of Nicholas Trist. And when he got back with this treaty, there was a lot of criticism directed against him. There were a lot of people who said, "Hey, look, we're still paying him $15 million, and you know, what's the deal here?" You know, and a lot of folks thought that we ought to ask for more, that we ought to be demanding more and more territory, like a big chunk of what is today northern Mexico. But Polk, he knew how unpopular this war had been. He knew that there were a lot of folks up north who had been opposed to the war from the get-go. And he was afraid that if the United States got too greedy and demanded that Mexico hand over territory inhabited by Mexican nationals, then that would only relaunch the war and prolong the conflict, and it just wasn't worth it. You have to remember that the territory that was given by Mexico to the United States was only sparsely settled by Mexicans. But if the United States had asked for big chunks of northern Mexico, that would have meant demanding that large numbers of Mexican nationals be handed over to the United States, and that would have been completely unacceptable to Mexico. So in the end, the treaty as negotiated was ratified by the United States, and that basically ended the war. And that saw the end of the war. And so when the war was over, the United States had acquired a big chunk of territory. But what would happen next was that Americans would be divided about what to do in these territories. Should slavery be extended to these territories, or should these new territories become free states? And this issue would divide North and South in the years that followed. And but before we can see how the North and South, why there was so much disagreement about the issue of slavery in the territories, we have to look at how the North and South had gone different routes by the mid-19th century, and that's what we're going to be looking at in our next lesson.